This video discusses the grid widget. The grid widget is one of, if not the most important widget within Quincy. The reason for this is because many of the other widgets within the product will listen to the grid and respond to the data which is being displayed, either because a filter is being used or a column group, etc. So let's open the widget and take a tour of what's inside the grid. I already have a case open and I've now opened the grid. First of all, we can see that the grid contains a file listing. Before we discuss this in more detail, let's look at the bottom of the screen and see the data which is being reported in this case. As you can see, in this case we have a total number of 1,494 case items. This is the total number of objects in the case. Next we can see the total number of items which are responding to a filter, and we can look at this more closely in a moment. Thirdly, we can see the number of items which are presently in the grid. Let's just spend a moment discussing what this means. Quincy works in HTML5, and as we get to know the product and work within our cases, we can start to take advantage of a number of opportunities to optimize the speed of the product. One of these opportunities is the grid size. If we come to the top of the screen, we can see that the grid is currently set to display 100 items. This is set this way so that if we have a case with something like 1,000,000 data objects, we don't necessarily want nor need to load all of them in the beginning, as it's unrealistic to think that we'll review 1,000,000 items line by line. As investigators, we take advantage of filtering and grouping of data to specifically locate the data types that we require to view, and then refine the number of items in the grid. Let's pause for a moment and take the opportunity to look at some of the quick filtering options that we can use within the grid. We can take advantage of the filters on the left to perhaps filter for specific artifacts such as data which is encrypted, and we can also take advantage of the data categories which appear at the top right of the screen. Using these filters will allow us to reduce the size of the data set based on the data that we want to review. In this case, pictures. We can then, once we've got the filtered data set down to a suitable size, we can then set the grid size to a size which is suitable for the data set that we want to review rather than the entire data set. Going back to the bottom of the screen, we can see that the filtered items have now resolved to 185 items, which means that we can now adjust the grid size to make that more suitable for us and bring all of the data into the grid at the same time. And this is done by simply adjusting the size of the data in the boxes and then using the refresh button on the right hand side of the screen, which will resolve the grid size to ensure that all of the data that we want to review is all on one page. We can now see that the grid size is now resolved, which is now matching the size of the filtered data. Let's continue to look at some of the additional features within the grid widget. On each individual line within the grid, we can see that there are 3 buttons. The first button allows us to view the file within the grid. Clicking on the button will bring in the viewer widget so that we now have the viewer and the grid working together. Once the grid and the viewer work together, we can then continue to review the items line by line, and the viewer will respond so that we can review each individual item accordingly. The second button that we can see allows us to locate the file, and this allows us to see the file in an Explorer view using and taking advantage of the filter widget. And now we can see that we have 3 widgets working together. If we no longer require to see the viewer, we can simply close this down and we now have the filter and the grid widget working together. We can now see the item is located in a file hierarchy, just as we would in the Explorer view in FTK or Lab, etc. The third button allows us to mark a specific item as privileged, and this is when we can take advantage of isolating and removing items from the case so that other users and perhaps reviewers don't necessarily see these items, and this can be in circumstances of legal professional privilege or when perhaps data is somewhat unsavoury and we don't want other people to see this. This can be discussed in more detail in other videos that relate to users and roles. We can now remove the filter widget so that we can get back to just seeing the grid in the entire view. We can also see that we have the options to check all of the items that exist in the grid, and we can do so by clicking on the button. Clicking on this button will check all of the items that are in the current grid view, and we can also remove them just by clicking on the button which is adjacent. This small button that we can see will remove the options of the three buttons as we can see, and clicking on it will remove those from the grid view. And of course, clicking on it again will bring them back into view also. There are a number of columns within the grid, and these can be adjusted in various different ways. As we can see, there are a number of different items and columns within this section, and it may be that sometimes, just as we would with other Access Data products, we may wish to change the column groupings based upon the type of data which we currently have to review. At the moment we're using the general columns, and we know this because of the button which we can see on the right hand side of the screen, and we can see that there are a number of options by clicking on this item. We can adjust the different types of columns that we want to see based on a specific need or a specific data type. For example, if we wanted to look at data that pertain to emails, then it would be a good idea to see email related columns. In Quincy we have something that is additional, which is also the speed column. And speed columns are important to Quincy because they allow us to resolve the grid very, very quickly. By using the speed columns, we see just the minimum amount of data that is required to report the data in the grid, and this provides us with the ability to simply see the data that we need to bring the data into the grid efficiently and quickly, and at that point then we can decide to bring in and determine the type of column groups that we actually need. Column groupings are discussed in much more detail in other videos. Additionally, we also have the ability to filter on any of the columns that exist in the grid, and this is done so by clicking on the filter icons in the columns. Here we can see that we can search for data that exists within specific columns using the operators, whether they contain, are equal to, etc., to identify specific data that we require to find within the grid. Additionally, there is a great deal that we can do with using right-click options in the grid. Clicking on an item and right-clicking provides us with a large number of options which we can then use to be able to label, bookmark, tag files, etc. And many of these items are discussed in further videos. However, one of the particularly useful features within this right-click view is to be able to look at the file properties. Clicking on this icon, clicking on this menu we'll bring in the properties that relate to the file in question to allow you to be able to see data relating to creation dates, modification dates, etc. This data can be customized in the admin widget. Another feature of using the right-click menu is that we can export files, and we can see that we can export checked items, selected items, and we can also export items to a CSV file, perhaps so that we can add this information to our records or notes. So this is an overview of the grid widget. I hope that you found it useful, and please be sure to review some of our other videos, particularly in relation to column groupings and filtering. Thank you.